Okay, and then I'll hand it over to Amelia. Go for it.
Awesome, thank you. So I'll just do a really quick introduction in case you haven't met me before or watched any of the previous live streams that I've done. My name's Amelia. I'm an artist and illustrator. I live in Baltimore, Maryland. And I also teach art at a local university, at Towson University, and I'll also be teaching art at a community college this coming semester. So I love to teach art and talk about art, and I'm excited to show you some watercolor techniques today. So I'm going to switch over to my camera here. Thank you, Lee. And I'm just going to really quickly click out of that. Great. So I'll do a really quick just overview of everything that I'm working with. Um, I'm really mostly going to be working with the materials that came in last fall's or this past fall's box. So that is this agave watercolor paper. This is the, I believe the hot press. Feels like hot press, doesn't have a lot of grooves, so it's hot press paper. The core watercolor set. I'll open up. You can see mine is already very well loved. I'm somebody whose art supplies always look very worn after I've used them. But I think that's a good thing because it just means that I'm really getting the full use out of them. So I have that here. Then I have the two brushes that came in the kit. So it's the angled brush and the round brush. And I also grabbed the Sennelier ink brush so that we could do some outlines or some other detail work with that. And then my water cup, the collapsible water cup, which is really awesome. I love that it can fold up, and we were just talking a little bit about how portable the watercolors are. So this is really great if you're doing something like if you go outside of your house, if you want to paint outside, or if you go to a cafe. This is really handy because you can close it up and put it into a pencil case. And in fact, this was an ArtSnacks pencil case that we recently got, and this one's really nice. So if you have something like this, you could totally fit all of your art supplies in there and travel with it. So there are a couple of things I have that did not come in the box. So if you don't have them, not a big deal. Whatever you have is fine. Oh, Amanda, you love the cup. Yeah, me too. It's really great. And something that's cool, if you noticed in the little literature that comes in the box, you can actually sit your pen or your brush on top of the grooves here, and you can rest it so that you don't leave it sitting in the cup, which I'm really bad about forgetting to take mine out because I get a little distracted, walk away, and then I come back and my poor brush is all flat. So you can rest your brushes on the water cup like that. So back to what I was saying, the things that I have that are not in the box, I have just a ceramic palette so I can mix some colors. But if you don't have one and you don't have a palette at all, not a big deal because you can use the case that your paints came in as a palette as well. And I've done that before too. So it's pretty cool that it comes with these little wells so you can mix them in there if you need to. Um, so that's that. And then I have some, this is pretty cool. I got these crayons at a secondhand store. So these are not the contemporary crayons that you'd see, but they are still the same, just Crayola wax crayons. Because I'm going to be using them for a resist technique for this. But if you don't have crayons, not a big deal. Same if you don't have any of the resist tools, that's okay. It's not really necessary for this painting. You can totally complete it without having it, but if you want to try some out, this is a good exercise to do it. So I picked out a couple crayons in advance that I used for my example, so I just left them out. So if you see me grab some crayons, that's that. Try to have them not roll away. And then I have a kneaded eraser. I have some washi tape. And then I also grabbed, this is also one of the resist techniques. I didn't mention that I'd be using it, but I thought it might be cool in case you wanted to see it in action. I grabbed some salt so that you can see what happens when you add salt to a watercolor painting. Again, if you don't have it, not a problem. If you want to run and grab some, you totally can. But yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and just push some of this stuff aside. So now you know what I have that I'm working with. just in case you have to run and grab anything. Give myself a little bit more room because I have my paper sideways. Okay, so I already started to trace out my drawing. And I can show you really quickly how I transferred my drawing on here. So this was the example that I showed everybody on the mixed post. And then this is my drawing that I did. I sketched everything out in Procreate, so I drew it digitally. I like to do that because sometimes when I sketch on paper, I draw something a little bit too small, and then I have to kind of either start a new drawing or erase it and draw it again bigger. What I like about sketching digitally versus sketching on paper, sometimes, not all the time, but if I want to reposition or resize something, it's very easy and quick to do. So then I just printed it out, and on the back, I used some graphite and went over my lines like that. I taped it onto my paper, and I took a ballpoint pen. Usually just a regular ballpoint pen works really well for this. I traced over all my lines. And if you tape both the bottom and the top, you can flip it over to check to make sure that all your lines transfer. So if you need to go over anything again, you're not accidentally repositioning it in the wrong place. So that's a really handy tip for if you do a drawing or a sketch on one piece of paper. Another reason that I like to sketch digitally and then print it out to trace it is that in case I make a mistake or I want to do more than one version, and I may have poked through my paper pressing too hard or something, I can print out another version, which is really nice. So that's just a tip from me. And thank you. I'm glad you think that it's cute. I tried to make it a cute little fun friend. So this is kind of what you'll get after you transfer. And the reason that I recommend a kneaded eraser is the next step that I like to do after I transfer my drawing is I just like to use a kneaded eraser, and I kind of roll it over top of the pencil work so that I'm not completely erasing it, but as you can see, it's a lot lighter where I can still see the line work, but when I go over the graphite with the watercolor paint, it's not showing through as strongly. Now, I will say I didn't do that for this version, and I didn't have too much of a problem with it, but I did notice that a lot of the pencil work was showing through. And I just personally prefer not to have the pencil work show through, because if I want to change something, it's a little bit easier and I don't have to worry about having really dark lines. The other thing that is helpful if you're erasing it and it's a little lighter is that depending on how hard you pressed on your drawing when you transferred it, it will leave a little bit of an indent in your paper. So if you find that it's hard to see, you can kind of tilt it towards the light a little, and it'll help you see some of those indents as well, which I think is helpful. But I don't recommend pressing very, very hard, only because you don't want to damage your paper and you may rip through your original drawing as well. So just, I would say anywhere from like a medium amount of pressure to medium hard, just depends on how well it transfers. But that is, so it's a little harder for you guys to see, but hopefully in your versions, you're able to see the line work just enough that you can be able to see. I like to use this method of transferring where you just sort of go over it in graphite and then trace for something that's on a watercolor block like this. So all the pages are glued together. And in previous demonstrations, I cut the paper off and then I used a light table to transfer. And there's nothing like that. Sorry, there's not a problem to doing it that way. But the downside of cutting your watercolor paper off the block before you paint on it is the glued edges help to keep your paper flat. So you might have a little bit more buckling. But I found that this paper in particular has been really nice because it's very absorbent and I don't have too much trouble with buckling. So I see there's a question about working with pastels. I do think that that would work. And we'll talk a little bit. I'm just going to do a really quick review of different resist techniques. But I would caution that it might want to test it on a piece of scrap paper first, where you just kind of put a little swatch on and then test putting watercolor over it, because depending on if they're waxy or not, they might lift with when you put the watercolor or the wet brush on it. So just test it first. And the if it seems like it's not going to lift and it's going to resist the paint, then I think that's fine to use. So that's a great question. So that's a great segue into talking about the resist materials. So if you had a chance to look on Mix this past week, I went over some different techniques for resisting watercolor. So this is kind of a mixed media approach, and I thought it would be fun to introduce that into the project for this live stream. So I mentioned I'm using crayons. I thought that would be really good for this demonstration because that's very accessible. I think most people probably have some Crayola crayons or whatever brand crayons you have laying around. If you don't, they're really easy to go pick up almost anywhere. So if you want to try it, that would be something that's easy to try. But I went over a couple of different things. So if there's a particular kind of resist technique that you want to try, you're more than welcome to do that. So if you don't want to use crayons, you want to try something else, you're more than welcome to do that for this project, because this is your project and you can make it look like whatever you want. But the other cool thing, like I said, with having maybe more than one copy of a drawing like this, you could do more than one of these and you could try all kinds of different materials and tools and experiments and just see what happens and see what you like the best. So that's kind of fun for that. So what I did with this project in particular is I started with my resist materials first before I put the paint down, because the idea of using something that resists the watercolor is that it's going to seal the paper, so that when you put the watercolor on top, it sort of, I don't want to say deflects. I don't think that's the right word, but I mean, it resists the watercolor. So it doesn't soak into the paper in that spot. And I'm using colored crayons. You could use just white. You could add layers of color if you want. You could add, I just have fireworks, but you could add stars. I think I'm going to try adding some salt. So I think that might be fun. You could use masking tape, anything like that. So that's if you want to either leave the paper white, or if you want to have a particular color that shows through when you paint on top. That's a resist technique. Or if you don't want to do that, you don't have to apply the resist first. You can do a reverse resist, which is either adding water in to create blooms, or you can add the salt, or you can add soapy water, rubbing alcohol. That would be next. So I just wanted to kind of preface that. So depending on how you want to prepare your paper, to either do it first or just to wait. So that's what I'm going to be doing first, is I'm just going to add in some fun fireworks, and you can add them anywhere you want, or you can kind of follow along with what I do. I'm going to kind of change it up a little bit, I think. And I'm just going to go over the line a couple of times, because I'm trying to really make sure that the wax is sitting heavily on top of the paper. Then when I go over it with my watercolor, I'm not losing my waxy lines as much. That happened to me when I was doing my example here. I didn't quite press down hard enough. So when I added my wash over top, I actually lost my wax lines. So I learned from doing that I want to press down a little bit harder. This is how I taught myself how to draw fireworks when I was a kid, is I draw sort of the line where it's kind of shooting up into the air, and then I it almost looks a little bit like a flower, but I draw a broken line like this to where the firework is exploding. And I think it looks pretty, like you can tell it's a firework. So it worked for me, so I stuck with it. But you can draw your fireworks however you like. If you want to, you know, create a different design, or if you have a different way that you like to do it, you're welcome to do it that way too. But I kind of create a trail so it looks like it's flying up into the air. And I tried to think about when there's a lot of fireworks, going off in the air, they might be crossing over, the lines might be crisscrossing or maybe overlapping. So you can think about doing that too. But I don't have any particular pattern that I'm drawing them in, or any particular order to the colors, just whichever colors I think look nice for this. So I chose to draw, this is meant to be a wood dragon, because for the I'm saying that right, Lunar New Year. I didn't know that was gonna be, I wasn't expecting it to be a tongue twister. The Lunar New Year is going to be a dragon this year. So I thought that would be fun. Now, technically, the Lunar New Year doesn't start until February, but since we just celebrated the New Year this past week, I thought it might be fun to reflect that with the dragon. Okay. I think I want to add some red. Might do a brighter red this time. I liked this shade of red because it was a little bit more of a scarlet. But since I got this set of crayons secondhand, not all the colors are in there. So I didn't quite get the fire engine red, but that makes sense because I think that's a really popular color. So it must have been very well loved. But I think this pink color is actually pretty nice. I don't know if I've ever seen a pink firework. Sure they exist though. I think we need something up here. So maybe blue one. I do think that the white crayon does the best job. The white and the yellow, the lightest ones, do the best job with creating the resist. But I think it's fun to add some colors, and you could experiment with other colors as well. Now, if you're using a different kind of resist technique, like if you're using masking fluid or masking tape, something that leaves the paper white, then you can go back in and fill it in with a color if you want. So you can always add that in later if you don't add the color first. I was thinking to myself that I hope that these crayons are happy that they're getting used after going to like a secondhand store, maybe sitting unused for a long time. I just think that's kind of fun. I was like, you're welcome, crayons. I'm glad that you're getting used to make art again. So I just think that's kind of fun. I'm gonna add in, this is a little harder to see when you're drawing with a white crayon on white paper. So you might not be able to see it, but if you are having this experience where it's a little hard to see, if you tilt it towards the light, you can kind of see how it's not glittering, but glistening against the light. That will help you. So if you need to kind of just check where your lines are, that's a really helpful technique as well. It's kind of fun. I think I forgot where I put some of the white marks on the paper, and it was a little bit of a surprise when I went over them with my um with my paint. I was like, oh yeah, I did put one there. So if you can't see it, it's kind of fun. It's like a fun surprise. Okay, I think that's good. I think that's a good place to stop with my resist uh application. Now, you could, if you wanted to, if you have masking fluid, or if you want to use tape, or even washi tape and a pair of scissors or an X-Acto knife, you could also cover up your dragon, and then you could do one big flat wash across. I don't think I'm going to do that. I'm just going to kind of paint around it. But if you want to take the time to mask the dragon, that's a really helpful technique for saving some time when you want to do washes, and then you don't have to worry about trying to paint around all the little crevices as much. So that's another thing that can be really helpful with masking your painting before you add paint. So it might be something to try. If you don't try it with this one, I would recommend trying it with another painting or just experimenting. So I do have my one water cup over here that I showed you, but I also have a second one over here. And I forgot to mention, I think I was so excited talking about the crayons that I forgot to mention that I usually like to try to have 2 cups of water, one cup that I can use to wash off my brush, and then another one that I can use if I need to add water to my mix of watercolor paint. Because that way I'm not polluting my paint with the dirty paint water, especially if I'm mixing a lighter color like yellow, or if I'm, mixing a blue. If yellow gets in there, it's going to turn green. So, that way it makes your colors turn out more like how you want them to. So I have my bigger brush, my angle brush here, this one. It's the bigger of the two, so I think it will make the most sense to do the bigger wash with. So I'm going to grab a little bit of water with my brush, and I just dip my brush in a couple times, and then when my paintbrush has a lot of water on it, let me scoot this over so you can see it a little more. I sort of run the edge of the brush in my palette well, like that. And that gets me some nice drips of water like that, so that I already have some water in my palette when I add my paint to it. And I'm going to be mixing this kind of gray color. So that color's not really something that I got out of the pan. I did mix it. So I'm going to dip my brush again in some water, and I'm going to grab, this is Payne's Gray. Oh, whoops. I'm sure you can actually see what I'm pointing to. This is the Payne's Gray here. It's the darkest one. If you're not sure which color that is, you can take a swatch. It's going to be the one that looks like a really, really dark blue, almost black, if you get it really saturated. And it's less saturated, it looks more like a dark blue. That's the one that I'm going to be using. I'm going to grab some of that and add that into my palette well. Now in my other cup, not my pink cup, but my second cup, which is a mug over here, that's the one I'm going to use to wash off my paintbrush. And then can't see it, but that's what I'm doing off camera. And then I'm gonna grab, because I'm gonna warm this up a little bit because it's so blue. I'm gonna take a little bit of this. This is the transparent brown oxide, and I'll show you what it looks like in case you're curious. That's the one that it's this kind of orangey brown, almost like a burnt sienna color. I'm gonna grab some of that, and I'm gonna mix the two together. And it's gonna make this kind of, it's a little bit more of a neutral gray color, so it's less blue. So I've warmed it up a little bit, and it makes it a little bit more of a gray, like a warm gray color. You don't have to do that. If you prefer to use if you like the Payne's Gray, you're welcome to use that if you want to use that. You don't have to mix the color. I just prefer that. I sort of neutralize it a little. Just mixing up a little more on my palette because I want to have enough to last me through the whole thing. So I'm going to try to do, I didn't do as great of a job in my example because I was just kind of sort of, in my example, I was figuring some things out with how to handle a painting. So I have some brush strokes that are kind of all over the place. I want to avoid that. So I'm going to demonstrate how to do a flat wash. And hopefully that will be helpful for you. Also, whenever you want to apply a flat wash to your painting. So I start with just a plain paintbrush with clean water, and I run that across the paper. I know it doesn't look like anything on the screen, but what I'm doing is just pre-wetting my paper a little bit, and you'll start to notice the resist already if you also use the crayons. Because again, the paper is sealed by the wax. And I'm trying to keep my paintbrush going in the same direction. And just take care if you didn't mask your dragon to go around the edges and try not to cross them if you can, the lines. But if you do, not a big deal. You just take a paper towel and dab it up and let it dry a little. So what I am setting us up for is what's called wet and wet technique. And I did do a little demo of this in one of the mix posts talking about how to create a flat wash. So the idea is that when you get your paper wet already, the fibers already have water in them. And so when you put down your wash of color, it gets soaked into the paper a little bit more evenly. Oops. So that's why I do it that way. This was also a technique I learned in a watercolor class when I was in art school. And I found that it's been really helpful for getting a nice even wash of color. But the trick to getting an even wash is to try to follow the same direction. It's kind of like if you're using colored pencils or graphite pencils. You want to try to keep things moving in the direction of the planes of a surface. If you have your lines kind of going all over the place, then it doesn't really define the shape as much. And I'll say though that these rules exist to be broken, so there's always a time and a place to kind of have your lines going in every direction. But if you want something to look smooth, then this is a good way to handle that. So I'm just trying. It's hard when you have all these little edges. So if you have to sort of change up your direction like I am, that's okay, because you kind of have to get around it. But it will definitely help when you go to add your watercolor wash. And if you see that your paper is starting to dry out a little, because this paper is very absorbent, which I think is really nice. But then sometimes I'm like, I feel like I'm racing against the paper to try to get the whole wash of just watercolor on before it dries. But that's okay. It's not a problem because you can just go in and re-wet your paper wherever it has dried. So it's not the end of the world. You just have to go back in and add that water again. Okay, almost there. I'm trying not to add too much water also as I'm doing this, because if it's too puddly, then you'll get what's called a bloom or a back run, which is just what happens when you have too much water in one area and the paint dries unevenly. Okay, so now that my paper is nice and wetted, I'm going to go ahead and take my color. Just wiping a little bit off so it's not too drippy. And then the trick is you want to hold up your paper a little bit, and you just, now what you're going to do is drag the brush across, and you're going to kind of continue that line. I think I can use a little more. I was a little timid. And just pull the paint across the top like this. And you can see how you're, hopefully these are the results you're getting to. You get kind of a nice even wash of color. You might have to, again, kind of tilt around all the different shapes. But it should give you a nice even wash. You can add more paint if you need to. If you have kind of an uneven amount of color or value, just kind of brush it back out, just following the same direction. If you need to, you might need to add just a little more water at the bottom. That will soften up your edge. If you feel like it's running really quickly, you can sit it down flat. I felt like it was going to be like whoosh, flying down my paper, so I needed to slow it down just a little. And if we were just going all the way across, this would be a little easier to just keep going. Keep going like this. But we have a little bit of a challenge with this complicated shape, so don't stress out if you can't continue that sort of flat, even motion. Just kind of go until you fill up most of one side of the negative space, and then you can jump over to the next side. And if your wash isn't perfectly flat, that's okay too, because it really takes practice. This is something I've been doing for a long time, and I still feel like I can always use more practice, so it's okay if it's not perfect. And the cool thing about the angled brushes that I like a lot is that you can get a nice, uh, a nice flat, wide brush stroke and very tiny, delicate brush strokes. And if you do what I just did and accidentally go over your line work, just take a little, I ripped a little tiny piece of paper towel off and just dab it. And if you're really concerned about it, you could take your other brush and some clean water and just kind of go in, rub the paper a little, and then dab it. Won't remove it 100%, but it will lighten it up a little more. So I know it's hard to see because it's so light for you guys, but I can see it on my end. So that's just a little tip if that ever happens to you. You can easily go in and correct that stuff. That's also, when it comes to watercolor, I've mentioned this before, but I think it helps to hear it again, is that you're kind of working the opposite way that you would with acrylics or oils, which is fun because we were kind of chatting about how people feel like watercolor is more challenging than acrylic or oil, but I feel differently. I feel like it's the opposite. And the reason is because rather than adding more paint to get your highlights and working from dark to light, you're actually doing the opposite with watercolor. You're working from light to dark, and you're building up layers of color. But the way that I approach art, and I always have since I was a kid, it's just the type of artist I am, is that I use a really gentle touch. So I have really delicate lines, light, sketchy lines, and I sort of gradually build up color and value. So to me, it feels very natural to do that process, to use the white of the paper and then create really delicate washes of color that build up to become darker. And I think for some artists, they think the opposite way. It's easier for them to start with the darker areas and then go in with a white paint or lighter paints, adding white to them to lighten them up. And then they add the highlights last. So to me, I like kind of thinking about building up the washes rather than trying to add them in lighter later. So, but everybody's different. Everybody kind of thinks about art differently. Um, so if you're somebody who likes to build stuff up, watercolor is a great choice. But it's also another, we were saying too, it's really fun to just play around and be really messy with and be very loose. So you don't always have to worry about getting things to look really tight and realistic. You can be very loose. I think the key to making things look realistic, regardless of how tight or loose your drawings or paintings are, is just having a good balance of light and dark. Because I've found that even just completely black and white drawings with minimal detail or line work, as long as they have the contrast of really light and really dark, it can be really convincingly realistic. So I think that that's just something helpful to keep in mind, that you can kind of define your style however you like. You don't have to do it a certain way for it to come out with whatever results you want. So it's helpful to think of it that way, I think. So this is, I think, the trickiest part, getting this little area here in the tail, but don't stress about the details because you can always go in. I added my line work last, so you could always go in and define it a little more with lines later. Okay. So again, if you have a spot that kind of dried out a little, you can kind of go back in and soften where that hard line is, just with some water, some clean water. That.
Hey, Amelia, this is Lee.
Hey, Lee.
It's looking great. Love
Hey,
the techniques.
thank you.
Just letting you know we're about halfway through.
Great, thanks.
Well,
Time sure does fly when you're having fun. But once we get this layer on, then it's pretty smooth sailing from there, because then we'll just kind of fill in the dragon with some details and some color. And if you have other resist tools with you that you want to try out, you can definitely use those as well. I was thinking that I was going to use the salt on the sky to sort of create this illusion of stars, but I'm actually thinking now that maybe I want to use it on the dragon to give some texture to our dragon friend. Did my best to try to keep the lines going the same way, but it gets really tricky where all the details are, so just do your best with it and it will look great. I think when paper is really absorbent like this, the trick is just to kind of work as quickly as you can because it will dry from soaking up the water so quickly. But don't feel like you have to rush if you are just kind of figuring things out. But I do think that that is the trick because I work kind of slow. Sometimes, depending on what it is that I'm doing, I can draw really fast, but when it comes to things like adding color or painting or anything like that, I work a little more slowly. And so I think that's been a little bit of a challenge, but I do think that if you just kind of work quickly and don't stress out too much about a lot of the little details that you'll get a little bit more of a consistent layer of watercolor on there. So I do have some areas that have a little bit of bloom happening and some uneven areas to my wash, but I think it's okay. And you can always go in and add another layer if you want it to be darker. You could also, if you wanted to think about sort of varying, it doesn't have to be even, especially because the fireworks would be adding some areas of brightness. If you want to kind of play with the light, you could go in with a little water in some areas and you could darken it up and add watercolor blooms intentionally. So I just am adding a little bit of plain water here. Maybe I'll just dab in some color here where it might be a little darker. This is optional. If you want to do this, you're welcome to, but don't feel like you have to if you're really happy with the wash that you have. But I feel like I could do something a little experimental. And if you don't want to have a really hard edge, a trick you could do is to just dry off your brush a little and then soften out your edges with the dry-ish brush. And then that will sort of eliminate that really hard line. I'm just kind of dabbing some color in and letting it do what it wants. I also think the other thing, the trick with watercolor is embracing. It's probably going to do whatever it wants. And that's okay. That's I think kind of freeing, knowing that the watercolor kind of has a little bit of a mind of its own. So you just kind of let it do what it's going to do, and you'll get some really cool and interesting results that way. I'm just going to add a couple little more areas that are darkened in here. I'm going to soften out some edges. That, and then I'm going to move on to the dragon part. Just do a couple more little sort of spots that might be a little darker. Just kind of tapping the color in. And sort of softening them out a little. Oh, so I see there's a question about getting fingerprints on your paper. That's a really great question. So I have thoughts about why that might be happening. And it's also why I typically recommend not using your finger to blend different art materials. And that's because our fingers have oils on them. And with paper that's really absorbent, it's possible that when you touch the paper, it might be absorbing some of the oils from your fingers. That could be happening. Or I don't know if maybe like if you have paint on your fingers, that might be coming off too. But this was something I learned in high school, actually, in my high school art classes. My art teacher said not to blend our graphite and charcoal with our fingers because the oil from our fingers over time will yellow the paper. Which I was like, oh, that's really interesting. I didn't know that because I was blending it with my fingers. So over time it will start to age the paper a little faster because it's soaking in. So that could be possibly why that's happening. But I'm not sure. That's a good question that I might look into to see if there's some information that I don't know. Could learn something. Good tip. So, but if that is something that you want to try to like get rid of some of the fingerprints, maybe you could go over it with water first and let it dry and see if that maybe helps with eliminating the fingerprints too. So that might help. Okay, I think this looks pretty good. Um, and I am just gonna do, I think this worked for me in this example, so I'm just gonna show you if it's something that you want to try, but I took my little brush and some clean water and went over some of my lighter colors that I feel like got darkened a little and just sort of erased a little bit of the paint on top. And I think that helped lighten it up a little bit, just to have more of that yellow color come through, because it does get a little darker. You could also go over it with your crayon again if you wanted to uh, make that yellow a little bit more vibrant. But that's kind of just what happens with, whoops, now I'm getting fingerprints in mine. That's just something that happens with um, the uh, the wax, that when you put a color on top of it, it will sit on top. And if some of there's like a little space where the wax didn't cover, the paint will soak through the paper. So you might get some of that too. Okay, so now I am going to, I made this a golden dragon last time, but I kind of think I want to maybe make it a different color. Um, so maybe I will make the dragon, I think I'm just going to keep it gold. I think that's a fun, nice bright color, and it's a nice contrast with the bluish background. So I'm just adding water, grabbing some of the yellow. Now I toned down my yellow a little bit. So this is the nickel azo yellow that I'm using, and I just added a little bit of um, the brown, the transparent brown oxide to make it more of a golden color. Makes it a little bit more like orangey. So before I put that on, still my desk is tilted, so my brushes are running away from me. I'll rest it on my water cup. I'm just gonna grab a little bit of salt to have it ready and on hand just so I can grab it. So the trick with adding the salt is you have to do it while the paint is relatively wet, not too wet, but wet enough that it can still be absorbed. But if you want to add a resist technique, I actually put some crayon. It's yellow crayon, so it's a little harder to see under the gold watercolor paint. You could also, if you wanted to add some highlights, you could use your crayons or whatever other resist you have where there might be light reflecting on the dragon. You could do that now before you add your wash. You could add some type of texture like scales or something like that if you want. You can be experimental with this, so whatever you want to try, but I am just going to go ahead and put down a wash of the gold so that I can start to add a little salt to it. This is a little bit of a tricky technique, adding the salt, because like I said, you want it to be wet enough that the salt actually absorbs some of the paint before the paper does. But you don't want it to be so puddly that it's just a big mess of water and salt. So you kind of have to, and it takes some practice, but you kind of have to find that balance between the two. So it still has to be sort of wet, but not too wet. So before it gets too dry, I'm just adding some sprinkles of salt, and I'm gonna kind of add it as I go. You can see some of the drier spots it's not really soaking up any of it, but that's okay. Kind of want it to be a little bit uneven because I think that will make it interesting. And then just as if I were seasoning a salad. I'm just sprinkling just a very little bit. I don't want too much salt either, because that will also make a really big mess. So you don't want it to be too salty. And again, with this, it's really important to make sure that it's totally dry. I've been impatient in the past with trying to remove the salt before everything was dry, and it will kind of just smear and smudge all over your paper if you try to move it while it's still wet. So you just want to make sure that it's totally dry. So this may not be dry before the end of our live stream tonight, but I will definitely share with you the final results and how to remove the salt as well, which I did kind of address in the mix post, but I'll show you how to do it just so that you can watch me. So I'll make a little video if I don't have time before the end of the evening. Now, if you have the same thing that happened to me, you might not be able to see it because it's very subtle, but if you accidentally lift up some color, it's okay. Just kind of brush it out as best you can. Oh, I almost dipped my paintbrush in the salt. I think I've learned not to keep an open drink next to my watercolor cups. I think we've all had that problem of either accidentally putting your paintbrush in your drink or accidentally drinking your paint water. It's happened to the best of us. Yes, yeah, it's happened to you too. It happens. I have one of those cups with a straw now. I think that helps too. That really helps with making sure I'm not picking up the wrong thing. All right, so I'm gonna add a little more gold. It's a little too enthusiastic with the brown. Add a little more yellow. Looks good. And if you want, you could also, it doesn't have to be one solid color. You can also sort of blend some colors into each other. If you want to add some green, you can mix up some green. You can really do whatever colors are in your heart, whatever feels best for this. Amanda wasn't a danger you knew existed until you started painting. I hear ya. I would never think that I would accidentally drink paint water till it really happened to me. I didn't swallow it, but I did get a mouthful of paint water and I was like, oh no, it happened. It's like I can't believe it really happened to me. But I was okay. It was just watercolor. I mean, not that you should drink watercolor paint water, but I was okay. But it could have been probably would have been worse with other art materials, I feel like. I realized it and immediately spit it back out. And why I stopped using a coffee cup for paint water. Yeah, I know. I have one, this one mug that I'm using is only dedicated um, to paint water. I don't use it for anything else. So it has lots of paint rings all over the inside. But yeah. Get so in the zone, it just happens. So I kind of want a bloom to happen a little bit, so I'm sort of letting this part of the tail be a little bit more watery. That's why I thought it was fun to kind of talk a little bit about watercolor blooms and adding water intentionally to your paintings, because, you know, there are times when you don't want that to happen, if you want something to look really smooth. But I think it's kind of fun to use them intentionally, because you can add some really pretty textures that way. So I talked about this in the last live stream, but I'm gonna recap it really quickly, is if you have a little bit of a harder edge, I mentioned it already a little with the background, but if you just take a wet brush that only has clean water on it and not any other paint, you can sort of blend out your edges a little. You just have to keep wiping the excess paint off of your brush. And that's how you can soften an edge like that and get a little bit more of a seamless blend. So that's kind of the trick to that. And you get a really nice, softly sort of gradient type edge to it. And it works pretty well each time. All right, I'm just gonna use a little bit of this. So this is the most red color that I have. I think if I had a little bit more of a red, I would use that, but I think this works well. I'm just gonna paint a little bit of the inside, the mouth, around the teeth. That detail you can add. You want to add a little. I did that over here in my other version. I added just a little bit of red. If you have a hair dryer or a heat gun or something like that, you could also use that for areas. If you used salt, you could use that to sort of dry your painting a little more quickly also. So if you wanted to be able to remove your salt more quickly, you can. I actually feel like this is mostly dry. The only spot that's not is this part. So I'm just gonna leave this alone because I know if I try to move it, it's gonna make a mess. But I can show you how to remove the salt for the other parts that are dry. So I'm gonna grab, just because I have one handy, if you don't, that's okay. I usually keep old toothbrushes in my art kit because I use them for things like scrubbing. I use them to make splatter effects, that kind of thing. I also use them because sometimes I use them like a brush. You don't have a toothbrush and you have a spare paintbrush, you could use that as well. But because like what I was mentioning earlier about trying not to use my fingers on my paintings, I want to use a tool to remove the salt versus using my hands. So I'm going to use probably this toothbrush because it's a little more scrubby. But whatever you have is fine. You can use your fingers if you want to. There's no rule that says you can't. This is just my personal preference, why I don't do it. So to kind of avoid making a huge mess, they're inevitable when it comes to art, but I try to avoid it when I can. I'm just gonna take this because it's a scrap piece of paper, and I'm gonna tilt my painting this way. Just double check that nothing is wet where you're kind of brushing your paint or your salt in the direction. And then you can just kind of gently remove the salt like this. So again, you want to try to make sure that it's totally dry, because you will get like big streaks and make a big mess. But also it's just easier to remove the salt because it really sticks to your paper once it dries. So you might have to scrub a little bit. And if your paper is wet in any way, if you do that, you could damage your paper, because your paper is more vulnerable when it's wet. The fibers are softer. So there's more likelihood that you might rip your paper. So this is another reason why you should wait for it to dry completely. So it'll salvage your painting a little more. So some of it's stubborn. There's still some salt on there. So it takes a little scrubbing. That's why I wanted to use something that was a little stiffer, because I think if it was a paintbrush, I would be having to kind of go in and scratch it off with my fingernail. So something that's a little bit more of a stiffer brush gives you a little more oomph to get the dried salt off. So now I can just move that aside, and let me hold this up so you can see. Look at this really cool texture that the salt left behind. I think it looks kind of scaly. So that's kind of fun. So that's a way to get some texture by using what's called reverse resist. So instead of resisting the paint that is going onto the paper, it's sort of resisting the paint by pulling some of it out. So it's sort of the opposite effect, but it's still considered a resist technique. So oh, cool. Yeah, thank you. I'm glad that you like how it's turning out. Yeah, I do think this agave paper, even though it's really absorbent, can be a little bit more on the delicate side. So I'm sorry to hear that you feel like you ruined some pages, but I think the plus side is that you learned from that experience of how much the paper can handle, which I think is the great thing about ArtSnacks, right? You get to try out different materials and see how different things play and kind of learn your preferences for what materials you like to work with versus which ones maybe are not your cup of tea. So I think that's the fun of it. So I'm going in now that my salt has been removed, and so I'm softening out a little bit of an area that I want just to be a little bit more of a soft transition here. And again, I'm just gonna leave these alone because, wait, I think it's actually dry. That's pretty cool. This paper dries really quickly. Sometimes it works with you, sometimes it works against you. In this case, I feel like it worked with me. Okay. So, if you want to go in and add a little bit more areas with different colors and contrast, you can do that. I think I'm gonna, just because we don't have a ton of time left, I'm gonna jump into the next stage, which is gonna be the line work. So, oh yeah, so just reading out some comments, mistakes aren't mistakes unless you don't learn anything. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah, it's like, you always get something out of it, even if it wasn't the outcome you were hoping for to begin with. So you have a question about when I soften, how do I soften and not make another line where the water stops from softening? Awesome question. I'm going to demonstrate for you really quickly on a scrap piece of paper so that I can, play around a little more. And I'm going to use, I think, a bit of a darker color. And I'll do it on an area that's already dry here. So let's see, let me add, so how do I not make another line? Okay, so let me grab some color here. Let's do, this teal will be a good area. So I'll do by itself and then I'll also do on top of another color. So let's just say I have this wash of this teal color, but I don't want this hard edge. So I think what works the best for me is I completely clean off my brush. I'm using my dirty water cup now, wiping off on the edge, and then I dry it off on a paper towel. Oh my gosh. Make sure you can actually see what I'm doing. I dry it off on a paper towel. So now my brush is both clean and dry. And then I take my cup of water that has just clean water. Well, mostly clean. Sometimes you get just a tiny bit of paint in it, but that's okay. So I take some water on the paintbrush. I usually wipe off the excess on the sides. If it still feels too wet, sometimes I'll just give it a quick dab on the paper towel. But I will sort of do a light sort of scrub if it's starting to dry a little. Then trick is you have to wipe off that paint and you might need a little more water. And then you just kind of keep pulling it out. And this actually did create a little bit of a line. So I think the trick is also just to kind of keep everything wet and you might have to pull some of the pigment from the more saturated area. And you just kind of keep doing that and repeating and pulling it out and then smoothing it. And you'll get kind of and it takes some practice. I've been doing this for a really long time. So for me, it's something that I've um, done a lot and kind of have learned, the amount of pressure, how much water to use. So it feels a little natural for me, but I think if you practice it a lot, it will help with just knowing sort of how much to balance. Yeah, exactly. Keep working at it with clean water and a clean brush. Um, and just have a paper towel handy and keep going back and forth with sort of adding, pulling, wiping your brush, and you'll eventually get it to where you can start to really soften it out and get a really nice gradient. Um, and the other trick you can do if you're trying to get a good gradient is just, again, the trick is to keep everything really wet. Again, you just kind of can start with getting your paper wet first, um, grabbing some color and sort of doing that the same sort of idea where you're dragging the color down from the top and pulling it out that way. That will also give you a really soft sort of seamless gradient. So two different ways, but my advice would be if you have some scrap watercolor paper, just practice doing that. Um, and eventually it'll start to feel second nature, and you'll kind of be like, oh, okay, I want to soften this out, and you'll get into the groove of how to do that. So okay, so if you we're still working on adding some details, your dragon should hopefully be dry, especially with how quickly the paper absorbs. So I'm going to use the Sennelier ink brush this time to outline the dragon. But if you want to practice using the little brush, let me show you just really quickly. You can use this almost like using a pen. So you just put some watercolor on your little paintbrush. You can practice this if you want to just practice getting some control. You just hold it like you hold a pen, and you can outline your dragon using that too. It's up to you, whatever you want to try. On this one, I used my paintbrush to outline. This time, I think I am just going to go ahead and use this brush. Just make sure it's not too juicy. Sometimes with these ink brushes, I like to just give them a little test before I put them on the paper, especially if they've been sitting, depending on how you store them. I always store my pens tip down, but sometimes that means all the ink runs to the end and it gets a little too juicy. So I like to try to test it just to make sure it's not gonna drip ink all over my paper. Yeah, I'm just gonna outline in the brown here. You're also totally welcome to use just a regular inking pen if that's your preference. Whatever tools you want to use. You don't have to use just the tools from uh, the most or the last ArtSnacks box. Whatever you want to use is fine. So here's where I was saying that I like to have enough of the pencil line that I know I can remember where I had all my line work before. But at the same time, I don't want it to be so dark that the pencil is showing through everything. Because if I decide that I want to change something or maybe leave something out, then I have the flexibility to do that. So that's why I like to do the erasing part early on. And point out too that I got a little outside the lines here where you know, his tooth in the background should be. So this should actually be gray. If that happened to you too, no big deal, because you can always go in and sort of go over that with some of the gray. Or you could just leave yellow, not a big deal. But mainly just don't stress out too much if you have those little areas like that. I think it all just adds character to the painting anyway. That's the cool thing about things that are hand done. They don't look absolutely perfect like a camera or a machine made them. So those little spots that give it character are part of what make art so fun and cool and unique. So, you know, embrace those things. I'm kind of just jumping around, but you know, you can outline however you like. I do think that maybe it would have been good to start up at the top and move down, only because I sometimes will start at a lower area and then move my hand up. And if the ink isn't dry, sometimes I accidentally smudge it. So if you're someone who's like me, who accidentally smudges things, you can think about uh, how you time your outlines so that that doesn't happen. But I don't always plan ahead when I do drawings. I just kind of work intuitively. So that's okay.
It's looking pretty good. Let's say we
Yeah,
have about a little over 10 minutes left.
great.
Might be a good time to see if anyone wants to share.
Perfect. That's what I was thinking too.
So Sue or Amanda, if you feel like sharing, that would be awesome. If not, also totally fine. Oh, here we go. Sue, let me replace the spotlight and feel free to unmute yourself.
Oh my gosh, I love him.
So I hand drew the dragon so it does not look like yours.
Oh, but I love it so
And
much.
then when I had some um, masking masking stuff, but it
Yeah.
turns out it was dried out, so all it made was splotches. So
That's
instead, I
okay.
just went ahead with the splotches and I just made it part of the scene.
Oh, that's great. Oh, I think it turned out so nicely.
Very kind, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Oh, that's great. And I love the texture in the background. I think it seems like, you know, sky kind of has cloudy, sort of like it's not perfectly smooth. It has that sort of texture to it. And I think that comes through really nicely.
Thank you. Yeah, my
Oh.
backgrounds are always what I call a happy mess.
I love that. I think it's great. To me, it just adds texture and personality and interest to the piece. So I think it's great.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Wonderful. Thanks for sharing.
Thank you.
And then looks like Amanda might be sharing a photo in the chat.
Great. Yeah, that sounds
Also
great.
okay for her to do that, whatever she's comfortable with.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you're welcome to share it here in the chat. And then if you want to post it in Mix too, you can also put it in Mix if you'd like to share it there too. And same with you, Sue, if you want to put it in the Mix group, that would be great. And then people can enjoy it.
I'll sleep on it.
Right, I'm clicking on the image. I had to save it to look at it. There we go. Oh my gosh, this is awesome. So I'm looking at it on my screen. at home. But yeah, it looks so good. I love the purple for the legs, and the wash in the background looks really good. You did a nice job getting a nice even layer. That looks really nice. Great job, Amanda. This is so good. Thank you for sharing this. Awesome work. It's so cool. I love seeing how everyone interprets, how they pick their own colors. And even if we're all drawing the same dragon. I think what's so awesome and special about art making is that they all look totally different. They're all unique and everyone's own style. And yeah, it's just really cool. Oh, and so the wax that you were using didn't work. Oh, that's okay. Yeah, so maybe it wasn't wax based. That's all right. Yeah, I think that it even though it didn't show through, it didn't affect the wash of color in the background. So I think it turned out really nicely. And you could always go back in and I mean if you want to work with mixed media, you could use gouache to add watercolor or sorry, fireworks in the background. So you could go back in with gouache paint if you have some, or if you have acrylic paint, if you have paint markers. You could even use crayons on top. I think that would work fine too. So you have some options. You could do all kinds of fun stuff if you wanted to. Otherwise, you could just leave it the way it is, and I think it would still look really good. So that's so cool. Thank you both for sharing. All right. Well, I'll go ahead and keep working on drawing my little dragon, just adding a couple little details here and there. And we'll finish it out. I'm just adding a couple little scales, not all over the place, but just enough, especially because we have the details from not the details, sorry, the texture from the salt that I don't think we need to overload with little scale details because you get the sense that they're there, it's implying, and I think we understand when we see it that there are scales all over. So thank you. Oh, thank you, Amanda. I appreciate that. Yeah, I love to draw little cute, fun characters. So it's been really fun to draw the woodland creatures. I feel like I can't remember if I said this earlier, or maybe I just mentioned it to Lee before everyone joined, but even though this isn't technically a woodland creature, it's a wood dragon. So I think that kind of still fits the theme and fits the New Year's theme. So it's a little bit of a crossover. But yeah, and then what I like to do, I usually save this for last unless I'm using a water soluble pen or marker. Um, and I try to add my line work last. I used to always do my line work first. But I feel like I have a little bit, it's a little more loose when I add my line work last. And that's something I'm trying to work on is to be a little bit more expressive in my work. Um, I like Amanda's comment that anything can be a woodland creature if it lives in the woods. I agree with that, exactly. So maybe our friend lives in the woods. And I'll be honest that I don't know very much about wood dragons, so it'll be fun to learn about. Maybe that's something that they live in the woods. So I would like to learn more about that. I was thinking too that, if you wanted to do this drawing again or draw this character again, it would have been fun to maybe have him holding a little flag or something. Something like that. It would be really cute. Oh, I love Amanda's building a whole story about our dragon. He lives in the woods in a giant hollow tree and his hoard is pine cones. That is very cute. I love that.
That's so great. I love that.
Yes. That's great. Yes, that is where our dragon lives, and everyone's welcome to come up with a name as well. If there are any names or anything fun like that that you can think of, you're welcome to write a little story about the character. I like to think of stories for my characters too. So I think that's fun. I'm just gonna add just a little more while we're wrapping up, just a little more color to some areas. Maybe some yellow. You could always go into with if you want to add some more colors that aren't in the palette, whether you have watercolors, or if you want to add colors with your crayons or colored pencils, you could also do that too.
Sycamore the woodland dragon. That's what.
Sycamore. I love it. Okay, this dragon's name is Sycamore. He lives in the woods and he keeps all the pine cones. I like to think he would share them if someone asked really, really nicely for some. Maybe you have to answer his riddle. Something like that. Oh, okay. Now we have a whole story. Woodland creatures come to him when they have problems. I love this. Amanda, you are welcome to write a whole story about that. I love it. And if you do, please share with me because I'd love to read it because you're very creative and doing a great job coming up with a wonderful story. I think it's fantastic.
This reminds me of like David the Gnome. Do you remember that show?
Yes. Oh my gosh. I saw it and I was like crying a little bit because it was so cute. And I was like, he's helping all the animals. Very cute. I love it.
But I feel like David the Gnome, that show, he was like, okay, I guess, we'll help out. There's something going on with this animal. Let's go check it out and help it out.
Yes, I love that. Yeah, that's kind of like what Sycamore does. I'm just adding a little shading now. But yeah, I think this is just about wrapped up. So
Looks great. Yeah,
thank
and
you.
we're about at time, so if we want to wrap it up and we can
Yeah. Great.
close it.
Well, yeah, thank you everyone for joining this evening. I had so much fun painting with both of you and seeing your beautiful work that you both did. Amazing job. And I hope that, if you decide to share on Mix, that would be great. If you keep working on it and adding more, please share with everybody. And I hope that you learned some cool, fun things about using resist techniques and some watercolor painting techniques. And I'm gonna do the quick tape peel for you before we end the night, just so you can see those nice crisp edges on there. So thank you both, and I hope that you have a great rest of your night.
Bye, everybody. Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye. Thank you.